Welcome to the next episode in Applied Rationality. This is video 6, where we're going to continue talking about Tim Harford's book, The Data Detective, and here we're going to be sort of talking about the positive uses of statistics. Now, earlier in the book, we were talking about Huff's book called How to Lie with Statistics, and Tim Harford seemed to have some kind of misgivings about this book, but we didn't quite learn what they were, and now those come into a sharper relief, where we learn that the issue that Tim Harford takes with the book is that it seems to portray statistics as nothing but a game with at best no stakes or at worst cynical actors. But the whole point, or at least part of the point of the journey talking about the Hill and Dahl study, was to say that no, in fact, statistics can be used for good, and in fact, not just a little good, but when the stakes are literally life and death. And so, by a bit of an accident, because a few episodes ago, I kind of made a whole episode all about how science and statistics is not merely skepticism, right? You can have a sort of stultifying effect by thinking that all of, rationality is about denying things and being skeptical about everything. And but for this to be of any value, there must be some way of reaching positive conclusion. Now, for me personally, I think this is all, of course, how could I argue with that? Because I just made an episode sort of echoing exactly the same points that Harford is making here. It does seem to sort of portray How to Lie with Statistics as claiming to give a full and monotone kind of characterization of just what statistics is, and I'm not sure that's really what How to Lie with Statistics was. I think, it was possibly more knowingly, right? The author knowingly wrote it as only a particular perspective on statistics, and I think a lot of the audience would have probably, hopefully, read it that way. But I do grant that it certainly is lacking any real positive picture of what can be done with statistics, and one does have to worry what that does somewhat subconsciously to the reader when they walk away from this thinking about what they now know about statistics. But in any case, this is all kind of a framing for the entire mission of the book, which is to see how we can actually use statistics, use rationality in our everyday lives to make things better. It has real stakes, and there can be positive results. We can, in fact, take some enjoyment in our use of data. And so here's a list of questions that would be appropriate for the sorts of things that we'll be talking about when talking about this textbook. So, does Facebook tend to make us happy or sad, and can we predict why different people react in different ways? How many species are in danger of extinction, and is that a big proportion of the total? Is the cause climate change, the spread of human agriculture, or something entirely different? And so on. So you get the gist of where this is going. So Harford's book now resumes the story about the Hill and Dahl saga with, the tobacco company, and explains how the tobacco executives could see the writing on the wall. Not everything was in yet. There was still some debate, and this information was only starting to get out to the public. But the tobacco executives could see that for them, nothing good was about to come out of this scientific exploration. And in an internal memo regarding all of this, one of the executives wrote, that doubt is our product. These executives found a way to make people, one way or another, ignore the science. Some of the techniques included questioning the research on the basis of almost nothing at all, right? So it's merely asking questions. Isn't that a great phrase that we now have to live with? Merely asking questions, well, that's a great way to distract and delay any action being taken. And then they also called for further research, right? So when some of the research showed that smoking seems to cause cancer, they would demand further research. Again, a great way to distract and delay. It's right, in principle, more research sure sounds good, and certainly anybody who really loves science and knowing more about the world can't in the abstract, in principle, argue with wanting more research, but certainly when we're talking about people's lives being on the line and we need to act, that can be for the purpose of mere distraction. And so, yeah, if all of this sounds similar, this is exactly what I coined as bad skepticism. And so, continuing with Harford's book, he notes that, bad skepticism, not his words, my words, but, seems to be so much more a problem than what you might call bad reasons. That is to say, we less commonly find people making bad positive arguments towards a belief that they hold. Most of our bad reasoning is in the form of bad skepticism, using, extreme skepticism to refuse ideas of others. And so we look at a little bit of psychology that might help to explain this. A study by Edwards and Smith showed that people's biases affect their thinking most powerfully when they are trying to argue against an idea that they oppose. So effectively what this is indicating is a kind of inherent bias toward, sort of negativity directed at other people's beliefs. And one certainly has to marvel at just how many parallels all of this has to things that we see today. So these same tactics were already employed by climate deniers and certain conservative elements 2 and 3 decades ago, but today we now have to face the issue of Russian misinformation campaigns. And what do they tend to do? They tend to not necessarily promote any particular idea. Famously, they are just on a mission to confuse, to make everyone seem bad, to look as if everyone has a bias, that there are these corrupt systems that are impossible to fight. So they, too, are leveraging this fact of the power of our inherent tendency to be critical of things, that we do not identify with ourselves. And the use of the idea of fake news is practically a part of the Republican Party platform, and that is a huge example of bad skepticism, because that is, just almost the definition of looking at any conclusion that you want to deny and simply pointing to any source and calling it fake news if that helps you to not have to face facts. And so anyway, the point of all of this is, in a way, a mission to fight against all of these trends, these ancient, so to speak, trends, certainly going back at least to the 50s with smoking and cancer, and which we have to live with up to the modern day. And the point here with Harford's book, and to some degree, the entire reason why I want to make these, podcast videos, is precisely to try to push us towards a kind of hopeful and active rationality. And so that's the mission of our book, and that's what we'll be talking about for the rest of the time that we talk about the book.